Hello, I hope you're all doing okay, or as okay as is possible, considering the current situation. Those of you who saw the video I posted last week might have seen my pinned comment saying that I'm going to try and post weekly videos from now on, and that some of what I post will be tutorial and tip videos. I've had a few people suggest various things they'd like to see, and I'm going to gradually be trying to work my way through the suggestions. I know a lot of people have been asking for quite a while about a shading tutorial, and I promise I will eventually do one when I have enough time to dedicate to it. That might not be for a few weeks, but I will get to it eventually. This particular video is aimed very much at beginners and people who don't really know much about Procreate, who are new to Procreate. It's going to cover what brushes I use, because I get asked that a lot, and how I use them. So it's going to be a fairly general video, and I do plan to go into more detail about things like line art and shading, as I've said, in future videos where I can dedicate an entire video to them. This is just almost like a brief overview sort of video, I suppose. I've actually found it quite surprising that I get asked so often about brushes, because when it comes to brushes, I'm pretty basic. I essentially only use 3 brushes for everything. There are obviously some exceptions. For example, in my previous video, I did use the light pen, which is in the brush library, found here. I used that on some of the lights on the buildings. That was quite a rare instance for me to use a different sort of pen. It just happened to work best at the time. But generally speaking, I can and will do an entire piece using only 3 brushes. The main brush I use is the technical pen, which is found in the inking list. I use all the default settings, except I have streamline at 50%, because I've found that helps create a smoother line. I haven't increased the maximum brush size, though I have seen other artists do that. But personally, I don't really like the softer edge it gives to the line, because in my opinion, my work suits a slightly crisper edge. But obviously, if you were dead set on using this brush and preferred a softer line, you could try increasing this size, because it does make it a little bit softer. I use this brush for sketching, line art, colouring, some parts of shading, and for adding small details and finishing touches. I like to keep my work process as simple as possible, as I am quite a slow artist anyway. I really don't want to spend time switching between brushes. And I actually find if I start experimenting with brushes while I'm working on a piece, I just end up procrastinating by playing around to see how things look with each brush. So if I stick to the same one, I stop myself getting sidetracked. This also goes for changing the settings. I generally just stick with the default settings. I know some people can create amazing custom brushes and things by playing around, but I'm not into that. I'm happy with the most basic brushes, and I will avoid changing them if I can, just to help keep things simple. I would really advise, if you are someone who likes using a lot of different brushes and playing around with the settings, that you do all that before you actually start working properly on a piece. because if you can figure out what brushes you're going to need at the start or before you start work, and ideally any changes you might need to make to them, it will save you time because you don't have to stop halfway through and play around testing out brushes to find out which one works best for what you're doing. And anything you can do to simplify your work process is generally a good thing. So when it comes to sketching, though there are obviously sketching brushes in Procreate, I will literally just set the technical pen to a large-ish size. In fact, I think I usually have it on maximum. And then just start sketching using a different colour from what the line art will be. Or sometimes I'll set the layer on a lower opacity. I do not decrease the opacity of the actual brush itself, just the layer. I almost exclusively use the technical pen on maximum opacity. I don't think I ever really lower it, and this goes for sketching. I know some artists set the brush to a lower opacity to sketch, but personally I find that confusing to look at, to be honest. For example, if I sketch here using a lower opacity, obviously I do appreciate my sketches are pretty messy anyway, but so maybe I'm not the best example. But and then using full opacity, personally I think this is easier to read or look at than this, just because the lines are more decisive, which I think clearer shows the shape and where the actual lines for the line art will be, whereas here it could be any of these sort of for me personally, it just is easier to understand what I'm looking at when the brush is at maximum opacity, even for sketching. And this makes the line art stage much easier because I'm not having to try and guess where I meant the line to be. It does help when you're sketching to be as decisive and as tight with your sketch as possible, because then you don't have to go back when you're doing the line art and try and figure out what you were intending to do. So then when I move on to the line art and colouring, I just reduce the size of the technical pen, usually somewhere between about 7, I think 7 is what I mainly use it on, or 10, find works just as well. There's not that much difference between the two, I don't think. Though this particular piece I'm working on here, I got the pen set to about 20, just because I'm experimenting with thicker lines. But generally between about 7 and 10 is what I keep it on. And again, obviously the opacity at maximum. The other two brushes I use are the soft airbrush and the medium hard airbrush. Very occasionally I do use just the medium airbrush, but generally I stick with the hard one. These are used to add softer shading and gradients. Sometimes I use them in the colouring stage to add gradients, but it's mainly shading. For example, you might have seen in some of my speed paints, I'll have shading that's like one colour, and then I'll add a different colour to the shading, and that's usually when I'd be using the soft airbrush, or sometimes the medium hard, but usually the soft. So, like that kind of thing. Both of these brushes I use entirely with the default settings, except with the soft airbrush I do have it set to the maximum size, which I believe it was quite a lot lower than that, the default settings, but yeah, I've increased it to maximum. Just because I've found the default size wasn't great for adding gradients, which is what I needed it for. And increasing the size gives it a softer edge. It's much easier to add gradients with it. Again, I basically don't change the opacity for these brushes. I mainly rely on pen pressure or lowering the layer opacity, or I use the eraser sometimes to make it slightly more transparent. Generally speaking, whichever brush I'm using, I will use that same brush as the eraser as well. For example, if I place a layer of soft shading, I would then use the soft airbrush as the eraser, but usually set to a slightly smaller size than with the brush. And then just lightly erase to reduce the opacity of it, rather than reducing the opacity of the brush. And that's pretty much it. Those are the brushes I use 90% of the time, or even 95% of the time, to be honest. As I said, I'll be going into more detail about my actual drawing process in future videos. This was just a brief overview because it's something I get asked about a lot. And I hope it was useful to some of you. Feel free to suggest down in the comments things you'd like to see in future videos. That doesn't necessarily have to be tutorials. I'm open to any sorts of suggestions and comments of any kind, and questions and likes are always super appreciated. I do love to read your comments. And if you didn't find this video useful, or if you didn't like it, just you didn't generally like it, feel free to dislike it. I'm happy to receive any and all feedback, whether it's negative, positive, it's all good. Thank you for watching. I wish you all the best, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.